Welcome to Complex Creatures, exploring spirituality and the common good.
Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to Complex Creatures, our podcast where we like to explore spirituality, but not only for personal growth or development, but rather as an underutilized tool for the common good. My name is Jarrod Longbonds. I'm the senior minister of Peachtree Christian Church. I tell people I have a PhD in theology. That just makes me a theology nerd. I'm with my friend Alan Barnes, who's a professor of digital communication and all-around cool guy. How you doing, Alan?
I'm doing fantastic. Great to see you again.
You too. I'd like to think of Alan as part of my tribe when it comes to all things spooky seasons and monsters and all that. Today on Complex Creatures, we're going to ask the question about monsters. Why do we create monster stories, monster characters? Why do we engage in those kinds of narratives? What might they say? I have no belief that we're going to exhaust the concept in one podcast, but I think we're going to have some fun thinking about it. Is the late October season when we record this? But before we dive in, I just wanted to say, Alan, can you share with our audience some of the content that you make and are working on that has to do with monsters, perchance? I'd love to share with what's going on in your creative life.
Yeah, sure. Well, the biggest thing that's probably pertinent to our conversation is I illustrate a novel series by a friend of mine named Tim Price. Tim is a recovery minister out of Minnesota. And his book is called Big in Japan. His book series is called Big in Japan. It is about a rock band that fight kaiju and a giant cowboy robot. Kaiju being giant monsters.
Everybody.
And right. And it's a Godzilla parody, straight up. And it does pretty well. Like we've been featured on MTV.com and that kind of thing. And when we go to the Godzilla Festival in Chicago, we have a decent little following. And it's a lot of fun to do. And but the real thing is that Tim is a recovery minister. You know, Tim is 30 years sober. And we're all very proud of him for that.
We should get time and talk about that. Can we do that?
Oh, yeah. Oh, I'm positive I can get Tim on to talk about that. But anyway, he wrote this book with the kaiju being metaphors for alcoholism, and specifically in relationship to his past being, a rock guitarist in Las Vegas, and that's how I know him, is in the context of working with him on musical projects earlier on in our lives, and we've moved on to doing a bunch of other creative stuff. The other book that I do, the other books that I do that are mine are I have a book series called Man Grooves. It is about a bluegrass band of monsters who solve Scooby-Doo style mysteries, and that's written for a middle grade audience. And I explore a lot of things in there about the idea is that all of my monsters are based on the seven deadly sins, in the same way that the characters of Gilligan's Island are based on the seven deadly sins, and so they interact in that way. My first book is all about envy. My second book is all about greed. So and that one's coming out probably in about a year. And then the other comic book that I do is called Black Chaos Comes Again, and it is a retelling of classic monster stories, if the monsters were teenage girls living in the Mississippi Delta. So far, I have released a mummy story, and my forthcoming one is a werewolf story.
Nice. Wow, that's fantastic. Well, friends, from my angle, I mean, if you're interested in anything I've done outside of this, I published an essay in a book called Theology and the Undead. It's edited by John Moorhead and Kim Paffenroth, religion scholars. And that book is a volume of essays on zombies and vampires. And the question is, why are they popular in society again? And this is now dated pretty middle 2010s. And I wrote a chapter called Vampires Are People Too, Personalism in the Buffyverse, which was about the character Spike. But I've always been drawn to the character of the vampire. I've written elsewhere and talked about monsters elsewhere. Frankly, I, like most people, have a curiosity about why sometimes I'm drawn to things that are scary. And so I thought, let's take the opportunity now to talk about some monsters and maybe what it is that they tell us. Kind of at the outset, Alan, I just want to say that monster theory is an actual thing. A couple of things I like to highlight from the vast field of monster theory is that monsters from antiquity are often symbols or signs or warnings. They're usually they feature in stories to give a warning to the characters about what's to happen or that something of a sea change is happening. Often they're composite creatures, think of Minotaur and things of that nature. They're not just one sort of beast. They might be an amalgamation, making them thus sort of monstrous. There is a vampire scholar. When you look at the world of vampires, there's the literary and cinematic vampire, and then there's the vampire or the folkloric vampire. Sure. And I can't recall the name off the top of my head of one scholar, but they say that each generation creates the vampire it needs. And that's just true for monster stories, and it's also true for the horror genre writ large. Each generation or culture or community creates the monsters it needs in some way to express their anxieties, to tease out questions about life, or maybe they are just expressions of deep and profound fears. So those are some summary points and some assumptions I would make about why we tell monster stories. Do you have, Alan, anything you'd like to add to that? I hear the stories you're creating are rather metaphorical. So they serve that kind of end, right? They say something more than the monster itself, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's the reason to do monster stories in general, or frankly, most fiction I feel this way about is it should serve as a metaphor for us to talk about ideas in a context that might be more fun to explore them, might be a little bit disarming to explore them that way, as opposed to talking about it on the nose. I think that sometimes when we talk about tough topics like alcoholism, the people who are alcoholics that are suffering with that problem in their lives may not be willing to hear everything that one has to say about the destructive force of alcoholism, but if you tell them a kaiju story, they might be open to hearing it, and that can be effective, and sometimes more effective than talking to someone about something directly.
And to make your point about that in particular, I was watching, my family, like many families, loves Stranger Things. In the most recent season that came out a few years ago, the character Max is mourning her stepbrother's death. And she's being haunted by the big bad of the season, which I can't now remember the character's name. She's sitting in her brother's grave, and she's listening to that song, Running Up the Hill from the 80s. And she actually begins to levitate in the air, and her friends see her, and they're trying to get that song in her head because that song is her favorite song and it grounds her. In her mind, she's in this hellscape of the Upside Down. And she's trying to get away from the big bad who's actually shooting, like the entire place, the surroundings, her environs are trapping her in. It's a living monster that is holding her back, and she's trying to run. And the song, it's all edited beautifully with how the song builds. And she sees this parallel universe open up where she's no longer, she can see her friends trying to bring her down from this elevated possession state. And she's trying to run to them. And I started crying, and I shouted out, I was like, that's alcoholism. That's drug. That's what this scene is about. This is a metaphor. I mean, it spoke to me of like people trying to get out of that monster and sometimes needing their friends and not being able to hear their friends at the right time. I mean, it was profound to me. Let's go ahead and dive in. Like Alan, do you have any monsters that you want to talk about? I've got a couple that we could talk about, but let's just think about a monster and kind of poke at it a little bit.
Why don't you start? So, because I've got all kinds of monsters I can talk about.
Yeah.
I think I'd like to get a beat on sort of the direction you're thinking before I start talking.
No, I mean, just real recently, I've been reflecting on the classic Universal Studios monster movies, mostly because I showed the kids Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein.
Well, my favorite reference to the classic monsters that I wear people out trying to show them is Mad Monster Party. Do you know this?
No.
It's a stop motion animated thing in the style of like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer or whatever, the Rankin Bass kind of stuff.
Oh yeah.
But it features Dracula and Frankenstein and so on and so forth.
Oh geez, no, I got to look that up. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Well, I showed them Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein.
Yeah.
At the church here, Peachtree Christian Church, and in Midtown Atlanta. I was doing a sermon series on the monsters. So like this very topic. 2 weeks ago, I talked about Frankenstein's monster. We had an interruption because I had a guest speaker, and this next week I'm doing Wolfman, and I thought this will be fun for the season. So right now, top of mind is Frankenstein's monster, which is one of the most profound and enduring images of modern literature. Frankenstein's monster itself, comes from this one great evening where Mary Shelley is with her husband and other literary giants, and they're off on a retreat, and they decide to tell each other ghost stories that night. Mary Shelley goes and pens the beginnings to Frankenstein, which becomes known as Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus. Of course, the story is really well known. The story is Dr. Frankenstein going away to med school, but is also a man of sorrow, having lost loved ones. And it's a time when medicine is at only at a certain level of its abilities, right? And he's captured in his imagination by alchemist literature and sort of Gnostic or secretive, scientific, dangerous knowledge. And he becomes obsessed with the concept of being able to recreate or create life, rather following in the tradition of the alchemists who want to create a homunculus or something. And eventually he begins to assemble pieces of corpse together to create one body and a brain and send a jolt of electricity through, and he creates life. And it's just this thing. And there's the modern Prometheus aspect. So there's this idea that he's overreaching, and he creates this creature that's not like Boris Karloff plays him in James Whale's classic. Rather, this is a very articulate being who develops and grows and learns, but he recoils and rejects the creature that he makes. And Frankenstein is the monster in it, right? And there's poetic thoughts about existence from the monster and all that. And that story itself has largely been understood as a cautionary tale about human overreach. Why would we tell that story? Because we are in a technological age. This is on at a primed date and time of the history of the Enlightenment, of human advancement and rationality and scientific inquiry and technological progress. But is it possible that we can overreach and in our attempt to try to grasp for control or authority over the world in such a way that we're reaching towards the divine or we're reaching beyond, and we don't know the calamity we cause along the way? Sure. There is this great philosophical little story that I can't remember who first said it. A listener will know. Benjamin, maybe. Well, it's picked up by Bruno Latour, the famous philosopher of science, a Frenchman, and Bruno Latour talks about the modern era or modernity. And now, Alan, you got to remember, every aspect of human history was named or titled after it existed, right?
Certainly. Yep.
People look back and say, well, that was the Renaissance, or that was the medieval. The modern was the first one where the people who were writing said, we're going to be modern now, which literally means right now. But what it really means is we're untethering ourselves to the past, and we're going to be right now. Right. And really what the modern tends to do is untether itself from the authorities of the past, the authorities of king or empire, the church, tradition, family, religion, race, all these things that are hierarchical or powerful over us to give our individual lives meaning, we're going to untether from for the sake of human inquiry, rationality, thought,
Sure.
individual. And so what Latour says, following a trope that was created by another philosopher, is that the modern man is sort of like a man who's fleeing forward in time, but facing backwards. Only face that which he wishes to separate himself from.
Right.
Form, God, religion, family, tradition. He's fleeing that, facing it, and all along the way causing consequences in his fleet. And he doesn't ever notice until he just turns around all of a sudden, and then he finally notices all the wake left in front of him. And for Latour, that's what the ecological catastrophe and crisis is the turning around and suddenly realizing, oh, this is the result of all the so-called progress.
Mm-hmm.
E.F. Schumacher is another author who, in this book, Small is Beautiful, and I quote this all the time. He calls it the forward stampede of modernity, the idea that we will continue to innovate and create, and we'll create problems and consequences along the way, but no matter, because we just believe that in the future we'll come up with better solutions to those problems we're creating now. We'll get to an answer to that, which to me is the height of immaturity. But but that's the society we live in. And so in a large way, I think that the Frankenstein story is playing on that real fear that we realized later in the 20th century with things like Oppenheimer and the bomb. Well, we've really gotten to a place where we truly can destroy ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm going to stop there and say that there are other interpreters of Frankenstein who have made claims that this is really about the transatlantic slave trade, and there's probably a lot of other layers to meaning here. But this is at least one fear that I think is wrapped up in the story of Frankenstein. What do you have to say about that?
So, as you were talking, the thing that most came to my mind is this idea about the modern and the idea that it's a time period that has named itself as opposed to someone naming a time period after the fact. By the way, quick side note, my favorite time period having been named by the people who came after the fact is the Baroque, because it means grotesquely ornate, and the people who came after it thought that it was the artwork from that time period was grotesquely ornate, and that always cracked me up. All right, finished with my side note. Moving forward, I was having a conversation with one of the professors that works with me here at Johnson University. His name is Ryan Seiske, Dr. Seiske, and Dr. Seiske is very involved in social justice issues, and we were talking about this idea of identity, and I was telling him that when I was a younger person, I didn't think that identity was important. And the reason that I didn't think identity was important was because I felt like it was just some made up thing that, didn't really have any bearing on what was coming for people. By the way, Dr. Seiske immediately, jumped to the conclusion that it was because of whiteness that I didn't need identity or something. And what I basically said back to him was I didn't think that was it. I think that the social landscape, specifically with the ideas of modernity, had put me in a situation where I thought I was supposed to escape from my identity. I think that was the idea that's sort of floating around our culture, is this idea that we need to become ourselves as opposed to be a reflection of anything that came before us or who we are from history or our family. And I think that is a big part of the problem that's been laid on us by modernity. So, it in your feeling, it displaces you from your from your given identity. Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think that tracks. And some of the interpretation I've heard about this being about the African slave trade
is that the monster is described as green, and sometimes slaves being described as green, right?
Right.
It's being as a thing, as an object, not as a person or a subject.
Mm-hmm.
And then recoiling in terror from the master to the slave, that language is used. And a lot of people think that this was just a metaphor for that. But if you really think about whether it's about technological progress or it's about slavery, both are issues of the modern age, and both are issues of overreach, or Promethean or overreach. The idea that you could possess another human being is definitely an overreach. Now, I know that has its roots in antiquity, right? But the criticism would be coming out here at this point in time, because of everything that it's wrought on the European, African, and American continents. But it's interesting how that modern mindset and imagination is pervasive. So much of the way in which colonialism has taken shape in the world is because of a modern imagination that starts with this idea that there's the world of the subject or the world of culture, and it's usually male, European, white now we would say, but male European, civilized society, right? Laws and customs and art. And then there's the world that's separate and apart from and slightly elevated over the world of nature, which is the world of the object. And that's plants and animals and interestingly enough, indigenous cultures. And that was the overriding like ontology. So like our understanding of being, but it was also our social imagination of that colonialist period that came through at the beginnings in the middle of modernity. And so it was easy to go to places with indigenous cultures and people who are more tribal and to assume that they were more like objects and more like nature than they were more like human. And
right.
And so that they could be, in some sense, dominated or treated as a resource or manipulated and used to whatever end. Which, if you're trying to create life like Victor Frankenstein, he might be trying to fulfill some sort of dark need to like bring back loved ones or whatnot. But at the end of the day, by stepping into that role of the creator, you are taking an authority over what you create, and you're diminishing that one's being, right? You're serving it to your own. That is all wrapped up in the story. I think that's why it's an enduring one. I mean, to this day, I mean, Alan and I, for those of you who are listening to this podcast, we do another one where we're rewatching through Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and it has Frankenstein story. And if you're watching these sitcoms and television shows through the years and you're doing spooky things, eventually you're going to have a Frankenstein moment. And I think because we live in a world where we technologically can innovate and create or manipulate the world to levels that sometimes scare us. There's the human spirit that says, go, 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 and do. And then there's this part of it that says, well, hold on a second. What's going to happen? This is where we're with artificial intelligence. There is no putting the genie back in the bottle here. And so the technology is like, go, 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 go. Let's see how we can make life better for ourselves. And there are people going, whoa, 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 whoa. This is getting out too far in front of us. What's going to happen? What will the consequences be? To me, our postmodern-ish world, whatever we want to call it, or our late modern world, or whatever this world is one where it's very obvious that we all know about Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus. We all read it. We've all dissected it and digested it. But why aren't we as a culture listening to its warnings?
Right. That's a great question. What do you think about that? Why don't you think we're listening to its warnings?
Oh, because I think as a society, we're rather immature. And, my wife would always say that old dictum, like maturity is the ability to prolong gratification, or immaturity is you can't wait. And so when I was reflecting on E.F. Schumacher's Forward Stampede of Modernity, and I called it immature, that's what I was referencing. Like, we can't wait. Let's contrast this with another society that has a strong interest in technology, and that's the Amish. The Amish follow a certain Luddism, so they're Luddites, which everyone thinks immediately, oh, that means anti-technology. The Amish and certain Mennonite communities are not just anti-technology categorically. The truth actually that each ordnung or each community decides for itself as a community what technologies they will accept or not based on how they feel it will affect their community and the health of the land. So I'm not saying we all should be Amish, but I'm profoundly impressed with the ability to slow down and ask, well, what will the impact be? Mm-hmm. Let's bracket over to the side that we probably will never fully know the full impacts before we make a choice about something.
Sure, of course. Right.
But I don't think we have a very strong caution at all. We have science fiction and horror that have been cautioning us for generations on things that we seem to just blow through as soon as we can. Soon as we can. And that brings us to another story that follows that same logic of Frankenstein that we watched, and that's Jurassic Park.
Certainly.
It's Dr. Malcolm's favorite quote. I'm going to mangle it, but his famous quote in that movie, your scientists were so obsessed with whether or not they could, they never stopped to ask whether or not they should.
Right.
I mean, I tell every Georgia Tech student that comes to Peachtree, I really wish every tech student was forced to double major in a humanities. It's your tech degree, but also study philosophy or ethics or literature or art. And it's because I think if you're going to build our world, you ought to be able to think through these other questions,
Sure.
Anyway, but that's me being preachy, right? But I think that's why I think it's why the story still endures. But none of us are going to go out and think the best way to create life is to put together pieces of a corpse.
Right.
Right. So that's not the part that really sticks with us. It's that part of us that realizes that we are capable of doing things. There's some, we get to this boundary of human humility and ability, and we're like, should we cross that or not?
Yeah, no doubt. As you're talking, I'm thinking about other modern versions of the Frankenstein story. And I think the first one that I was ever aware of as a little boy is there's a DC Comics group of young heroes called the Teen Titans. And the guy who wrote the Teen Titans when I was a little boy was a dude named Marvin Wolfman, and he used to write Tomb of Dracula for Marvel Comics, and that's how he got the gig doing this Teen Titans book. As weird as that sounds. Yeah. And when he got the gig, he created a couple new characters for DC Comics, and they're all based on monster archetypes, So his Frankenstein monster is a character called Cyborg. One of the things that I think really worked for the original version of Cyborg that he created was, Cyborg's father was the Dr. Frankenstein of the story, who was overreaching by trying to save his son's life as a result of a situation that he created himself. And I think that subsequent versions of the story where people have monkeyed with the origin story don't work as well because of exactly what you're talking about, this idea that we're overreaching and a warning about overreaching. I think needs to be part of the story in order for it to land in the consciousness. And I don't think that I ever realized that until you just now started talking about it.
The point of the sermon I preached a couple weeks ago, because it was on the Tower of Babel from the Hebrew Bible.
Sure.
It's not really a story about God's worry that humans can climb to heaven and all these things. That It really is a story about human overreach and human hubris. And so it's a story that we've been telling, whether it's, Icarus, Prometheus, the homunculi, the homunculus creature of alchemy. We've been telling these stories. Here in the Hebrew Bible, humanity's trying to reach up to the level of where God is. And so I think that's really a profound, warning for us always. But I think today where we see it, and a great example is in artificial intelligence, and the new word that's buzzing around all the research on this is enchanted determinism.
Sure.
The idea that we kind of know how AI works, but it works algorithmically and, in terms of software and hardware at levels that we can't really process in our own minds. We can't really understand. So in some sense, we get that AI right now is a predictive algorithm. Or if you're listening to Noam Chomsky, ChatGPT, what we really created is just this really great ability to what's the word I'm looking for when you steal someone else's writing and
Plagiarize.
Yeah, we're creating really good plagiarizers. That's all that we've really done. We haven't created a free thinking, conscious being, and I think he's correct. So what ends up is we become enchanted again. We all of a sudden it happens at a level to which we can't quite comprehend, and so it opens us up to this like, wow, look at that. That's amazing. It seems magical, but it's also deterministic. So what's being done right now, it's been proven by how AI would sentence criminals, that there is a bias against people of color, and because he's plagiarizing how humans have already done it. So the biases of humans have been infiltrating into AI, and we had no idea this would happen. So it's happening on all this research right now, where we're all of a sudden in this kind of profoundly tech world that's kind of blowing our minds and looking at the possibility, unforeseen circumstances and consequences. Can we move fast enough to fix it before it is out of control?
Sure. So I actually gave a lecture 2 weeks ago at the university. I called it AI snake oil, and I was basically trying to describe this idea that the promises of AI seem mostly a bunch of hooey. What AI seems to be able to do really well is do really easy things very quickly.
Yeah.
But it doesn't seem to be able to do anything complicated, really at all. And so as a result, I use AI a lot, full disclosure, for as an assistant, and it's sped me up a great deal. But I'll tell you what I'm most worried about there, man. And I think that this is a problem of human overreach, because now I have this assistant that speeds me up a great deal. Is I think that right now that's awesome, but I think in about 5 to 7 years, everyone's going to be used to people like me working really fast. And rather than going, oh, he can work really fast as a result of AI, let's give him that. So he's won his time back. What it's going to do is it's going to put me in a situation where I have to produce that much more.
Yep, I agree with you 100%. Listen, it's not to the point where I think AI can preach great sermons yet. I've tried it.
Yeah, right.
Wow, this is good content. It's just plagiarized from a lot of places, but
yeah, right, sure.
At least where it's at now, there's no flesh and blood in it. It sure. Doesn't, gives you some data, but it's not, but it'll get there. It'll get to where it's predicting our existential quandaries and things. Anyway, listen, that's one monster. Because I'm doing next week on Wolfman, let's think about the Wolfman.
Sure, sure. So what's the central metaphor for the Wolfman for you?
Well, firstly, I've been thinking a lot about it because there's a preaching on it. But if you think of Wolfman from 1941, Lon Chaney Jr., a couple of things about it. It is the only Universal Studios monster movie that is tragic, is in its end conclusion. The other ones are more glorious. This one's tragic. So it's got a different tone, that's for sure. And it harkens back to werewolf stories. So why do we tell werewolf stories? Well, anthropology show us that cultures from around the world have had shapeshifter stories and werewolf stories in particular.
Sure.
I don't know. They probably have various reasons. Some people think it is the metaphor of the human beast, the beast of us. Some people have looked back and said, "Hey, is this a way that in like the medieval period, like in the in the middle teens, is this like a way that we process the concept of a serial killer without realizing they existed?" And there are concrete examples where they think that might have been the case. Well, maybe. By the time we get to the Wolfman, at least, it seems as though we have two things that we can really easily land on. And I think as monsters evolve, maybe what they touch on changes. But I think the very simple thing that we can say about Wolfman is that it connects to the fear that we have over what Freud would call the id, or the base nature of our mind, the ability for us to be lost in our passions, aggression, anger, desire for sex, food, what Augustine and those theologians would say in Latin is the libido dominandi, the lust for dominance. I think another metaphor for the 1941 Lon Chaney version of Wolfman, and this has been commented on by others, is that it's a metaphor for puberty. I mean,
Yes.
he grows hairy. It's seasonal, and he's kind of like out of his mind, like a pubescent boy, adolescent boy. But I also think that that's the period of time in life where the id, if there is such a thing, right, is pronounced. Like that's what occupying the mind, teen boy is like those impulses. It's more impulsive, less about the what's the word I'm looking for? The executive function of your brain.
Right.
But ultimately for Freud is ego and the superego, but nevertheless it's those uncontrolled passions. And I don't mean passion by things you really love or into. I'm talking about base desires, right?
Yes, of course.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that that's the central metaphor to things like Teen Wolf, right?
Yes, absolutely. Which I just showed my son the other day, Teen Wolf. It's so they do that. They do that really well. He's going through a change,
Right?
And he doesn't get any of his more male qualities until he becomes the wolf, right? Or more of adult qualities. I mean, until he becomes the wolf. He's got push. He doesn't have any strength. He doesn't have any confidence. He lacks testosterone, it seems, until a similar story from the modern Victorian period that I think has the same sort of metaphor as the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Absolutely.
Stevenson. And I recently read it to my kids, and in that story, that's about this one character going through a change, a regular change that takes him away from his more cultured self, his self of the executive function and control, or his self that has shame, that cares about what other people think, and he's given over to his baser, more passion-filled kind of desires. It makes me think of John Carpenter. John Carpenter's most famous film, for those of you who are not in the know, is Halloween with Michael Myers.
Right. Sure.
He created other movies. Like, what are some of his other movies? You remember some John Carpenter movies? He's got some pretty famous.
Did he make The Thing?
The Thing, yes.
Yeah. Did he make the one about the spaceman? I can't remember.
He might have. Listen, I'll be frank with everyone. I only really like his Halloween stories. I don't really like The Thing, and those are classics. But
Escape from New York. That's the big one. Right.
Yeah, that's good. That's actually good. He often says there's two kinds of monster stories. There's the monster from without. That's the monster, like that's the ghost, or that's the goblin over there, or that's the alien from Mars or whatever. And then there's the
right.
And that's like Wolfman, werewolves. That's Jekyll, Hyde, that's other shape-shifting story, but it's mostly about the kind of monster that we can become.
Sure.
And I think that these stories are impactful in different eras and seasons. I don't know that I like very many werewolf films. The only one I actually really enjoy is American Werewolf in London.
Sure.
Mostly because I find them to be sort of schlocky, kind of rough. Can they be terrifying? I mean, I know that they came out with a new Wolfman movie like in the middle, 2010s or something with Anthony Hopkins, and it was well done. They tried some times, but at any rate, my point is like I'm not sure that it's effectively that monster is capturing the zeitgeist, but there are other versions of it, of the monsters that we can become.
Right.
Whether Jekyll, Hyde. I'm going to try to think of another. Can you think of another? A story that is about the monster that we can become?
I was so busy thinking about other werewolf stories. I mean, like there was a recent Sarah Michelle Gellar werewolf TV show.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I don't remember what it was called. Maybe The Pack or something. It was absolutely terrible. My wife really liked it, but my wife likes terrible TV. And there's the werewolf depictions in True Blood and all those sorts of things, and I don't think that those are particularly well done either. But that's interesting because I really like the idea of the werewolf story. The one of the werewolf stories, I mean, I can probably name a bunch of them that are made for kids that I really liked. I Was a Teenage Werewolf, I think, was the one that I liked when I was 12 or something. I thought that was hilarious. But as far as stories where people are allowed to and not have to face their own sense of morality. I think there's a little bit of that in the Invisible Man stories.
Okay. Yeah.
Let me think on it. What
I think
what are the
Frigno Incredible Hulk show.
Yeah, absolutely.
You would like me when I'm angry. I mean, it's that mentality. I remember Wolf, I think, came out with Jack Nicholson and Michelle Pfeiffer. That was a werewolf story in the 90s.
That's right.
There's a Werewolf in Paris, which it was not effective like American Werewolf in London. There's the Underworld stories, which turns vampires and werewolves into gangs. There's Twilight, which has the, all that's just shocking. American Werewolf in London is very adolescent, even though he's post high school and in college. But it is him, some sense, it is about his animal instincts, is maybe a sexual awakening, but this desire abroad in London on this backpack trip. But it's effectively a tragedy, and then he unwittingly becomes this monster, and he hates it. He hates it every day. He wakes up and realizes that he's gone out into the world and he wants to die. He doesn't want to eat out. Which I think that's a terrifying thing. I talked to someone in a counseling session once. It was a new mom. She was in postpartum depression, and she had an anger towards her child, and was just telling me how afraid she was of her own anger. Now, she didn't do anything, but has anyone ever been afraid of their own anger? Have you ever been so angry you've scared yourself? I mean, I think that touches in on the werewolf story as much as seeing somebody else be out of control, whether they're drunk, drugs, or but then given over to the base instincts without executive function. I think that's a terrifying thing, because we can become monstrous in those ways. So I think that's at the heart of it. And this Sunday I'm going to reflect a little deeper. Actually, I think that today. So in some sense, if this is what you are as a monster, you're kind of. If you're turning to the id, you're turning inward pretty fully. But I think today an interesting anxiety that we have is that we live in a world that says authenticity is the highest ideal. And because you have to be authentic, you need to choose yourself, you need to be yourself, you need to do what feels right. Gen Z and below or whatever are the most labeled and categorized generation ever. They have the most labels and titles and names and brackets. And all of these things are kind of a sign that we're kind of really turning inward, that we become our own reflections of the world and judging the world. It's a deep turn inward. And I think that creates an anxiety in us, this turn inward, because as much as it may be cathartic, for people to feel like, well, now I get to decide for myself who I want to be. I don't have to be who my family or my religion or my culture says I should be. I get to decide for myself. At some point, I think there's an anxiety, because as creatures, Alan, I believe we're actually made to be communal. So in some sense, we're made to experience a world where our identities are partly handed to us. If you have to come up with it on your own, where does it ever stop? It keeps unraveling and keeps changing, depending on who you want to be and how you feel at the moment.
Sure.
I don't know that is seen in any filmic or cinematic or literary monster right now, but I think that it's another way of seeing this kind of fear come out.
I wonder if that's partially the origin of like the shape changer monster. You never have a central identity. I don't know.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, I've given two now. You got one you want to talk about or have a thought or question?
Yeah, I mean, a monster that I think is interesting. I mean, if we're talking classic. The classic monsters, I think that the vampire is certainly important in society, or at least has been. But I think that the monster that supplanted the vampire in recent years is the zombie.
Yeah, unfortunately, I like the zombie personally.
Well, I think that there's a cultural reason for it. I think it's because of where we are as zombies ourselves, with our phones and our technology and our lack of interacting with people.
So it's interesting. So on the vampire, because the vampire shifted too, right? So
yeah,
folkloric vampires, I mean, they're not nowhere near as powerful as they are in the literary vampires. But I mean, this had a lot to do with sickness and health, like understanding the disease of a community, right?
Sure.
Garlic is a medicinal thing, and staking a body through the heart was staking them down. They would dig up bodies and see blood around their lips, which was from a bodily, I forget what disease might have produced that. But there's worry about people who had anemia and things like that. So it's fascinating how they done and how they morph through time. It's at some points the vampire is.
Yeah, it's amazing to me that's the start of it, because I feel like now it's just straight up a metaphor for exchange of bodily fluids. It's like a complete, it's a comment on sex.
I think so. I think in a lot of ways, but I think there's a version of it that's about parasitism. Okay. I think there's a version of it. No, I think it changes through time and who's telling the story. I mean, True Blood becomes a story that is, it's on the nose. This is about, in a lot of ways, it's about, are you going to come out of the coffin, right? Coming out of the closet. So there's a deep, it's about homosexuality and culture and being an alternative community. Sure. I like to, if you got Bram Stoker's Dracula, right? Even though Bram Stoker was an Anglican, that Dracula fit in a very Catholic milieu. Churches were off limits, and crucifixes and crosses. Mm-hmm. These were holy water. All of it was sacramental. Like the thing itself imbued the grace, right? You could not pick up the blessed host in the wine. That would have caused harm to the vampire. By speaking to Anne Rice's vampire, she was at this time a lapsed Catholic, very secular at this time. She creates a rather Protestant vampire. Louis talks about loving churches and they're beautiful, and crosses, finding them very interesting. They don't have any power if you don't believe in them. In a very Protestant, you have to have belief in it for it to convey power or grace and authority. But then it goes down the road of an absent presence of the divine in the world. It goes down to Protestant world where we go to certain levels of Protestantism that kind of flow into just sheer secularity, perhaps into nihilism, where this is meaningless and absurdity. And that's where, and by the time you get to Buffy the Vampire Slayer, you have a true postmodern version. Crosses work. We don't know why. Jesus isn't and the speech for many people. They never go to church. If I were in that world, I would be living in the church, right?
Sure.
It's a mix of folklore and new age and some old symbols. And ultimately, as you and I have talked, it becomes a metaphor for just teenage life and catastrophe that you deal with. And it's interesting you bring up exchange of bodily fluid. We should probably pull that one back a little bit more. I meant this is an interlude before we got into zombies, because zombies, wow,
sure,
they've changed in meaning too.
Oh, absolutely.
You actually have a zombie movie that you really like?
The zombie movie that I really like, I'm not sure. One that I really respect is 28 Days Later.
Okay, before we get there, go back to Romero, right? Go back to
sure.
Living Dead and all that stuff.
Yeah, sure.
Right. In a lot of ways, those are pretty subversive films.
Certainly.
And what are they subverting? I mean, they're subverting this kind of consumerist capitalist culture.
That's exactly right.
And we become mindless zombies of consumerism and consumption. Mm-hmm. It's pretty gross on how it delivers that message, but anyone who's willing to just look an inch deep realizes we're not talking about mindless zombies. We're not talking about voodoo or an island-based system that has this notion of a controllable entity or whatever, wherever zombies come from. But we have this idea that culture itself, the wider world, has turned individuals into these passive consumers.
Right.
By the time you get to 28 Days Later, zombies are different. They're not slow and mindless. Well, maybe they're mindless. I don't know, but they're very fast and aggressive.
Right.
What's going on in 28 Days Later? What's different about it?
It's being treated like it's a plague. It's being treated like it's
like a virus or something.
Yeah. That's exactly right. The reason that I respect the movie, I'll say this, it has very little to do with the metaphor. It has everything to do with the production.
No, I think it's intense.
Yeah. The production was made for just a shoestring budget compared with all the other movies of its ilk. I think that what it's really trying to talk about is the collapse of society. I think it's trying to talk about this idea that what Romero started, which is, we're all mindless zombies, consumerism, blah, blah, blah. It's trying to say, this is where we're going, is what I think. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think that may be very much the case. I don't know what the filmmakers, Danny Boyle, and them were trying to say, but it definitely has that viral component. And we live in an age of, you talk about the transmission of bodily fluids with vampires. Well, we live in an age where a virus is, and germ warfare, these kinds of things are on mind. We live, that's in the wake of 9/11, where we can start seeing buildings literally fall from the sky. The enemy is not easily identifiable. In the 1980s, right, the major horror films that hit, the major monsters, were slashers. You had Michael Myers, you had Freddy Krueger, you had Jason Voorhees, then you later had Candyman in the early 90s and Chucky, and these are big slashers, right? And in a lot of ways, they fit into sort of a very late time of Cold War, where we knew our bad guys. We knew them. They all sounded Russian in the movies. We saw them on the other side of a wall. They were other eyes. And so you could very easily notify your villain. But by the time you get to the new wave of the slasher in the early aughts after 9/11, you got Jigsaw from the Saw movies, not straight up slasher, but also it makes the villain much more challenging. In a way, Jigsaw is sort of helping save people who are otherwise on the path to destruction themselves. But if they're strong enough to do something very difficult, they can save themselves. Is he really the villain? Is he really the hero? It's less clear, but it's also less easy to draw a line on villain and hero in that story. So I think that goes to the thesis that we create the monsters and we create the horror, we create the spooky stories we seem to need as a society. Here we got a zombie movie. It's got a viral component about the breakdown of society. I think you're right. In this time frame, people are still telling that very same story. I Am Legend is a very similar story. Even that's like the third installment of that movie, right? That's been remade times. It's about a virus. The government messed up, and these things are going out of control. And they're not slow movers; they're fast, and they're going to turn you into a monster too. What's another? There's a television show right now. I really liked it. It was on maybe HBO. It's got Pedro Pascal in it. And do you know that show?
Oh, I don't know. Well, it's based on a video game. This is what I know. Last of Us? Is that right?
Yes. And that's the true horror of it, right? It's like this thing happens to your loved ones and who does it happen to? And you have, and all the zombie films right now are showing, it's like when everything goes kaplooey, how are we going to reorganize ourselves? The Walking Dead does something similar. And if you go to The Walking Dead, is the monster really the undead, the walkers, or is the monster really people? In The Walking Dead, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the show. I actually didn't like it. I watched a little bit of it, but I really, because at some point I didn't like any character. I found no one likable for a long time. And
yeah, I actually know a lot about that one. I'll talk about it in a minute once you finish your thought.
Well, at some point, every season seemed to be a redux of the one before. You get through the walkers, and then the next big bad is another leader of another community that is wanting to take what's yours. It falls into this Hobbesian, we're a war of all against all, social theory, rather than a theory that we will really help each other out.
Right, right, totally. So Robert Kirkman is the guy who wrote the Walking Dead comic book, and then was the showrunner for the Walking Dead TV show. And he's not someone I know personally, but I know a lot of people who do know him personally. And he very famously, in the comic book world anyway, pitched the idea that the zombies were created by aliens to his comic book publishers, because the publisher wanted another sci-fi book, but that isn't what he wanted to write. So he made that up for the pitch, and then he just never actually used it. What he actually wanted to do was just talk about human nature, and he never actually came up with an idea for what caused the zombies or what the zombies are supposed to represent or anything like that. All he wanted was a vehicle to talk about the basest morality of humanity.
So my theory is right. And I mean, I think that's what he's talking about there. I just disagree. Yeah. I disagree with him on what the fundamental nature of humanity.
Sure. Yeah, me too. Yeah, I got bored of that show after about the 4th season. I don't think I watched anything after that. And I think I got bored of the comic book about 70 or so issues in. Same deal.
Now, I will say that I think that's the malleability of the zombie story. And that's why, I mean, you're able to fit it into those different nooks and crannies of what we're dealing with as a society. You know, and so whether it's the mindless consumer bit, or maybe it's the mindless passive culture of the drug culture. You know, Shaun of the Dead was a great horror comedy, by the way.
Yeah,
Shaun of the Dead is playing up on all these themes, but the two protagonists are kind of like hapless dudes who are at the bubble, maybe smoking a little pot. Like, that's a culture. That's a real mindless sort of way of going through life. And something about that is being commented on. And so there's all sorts of ways of being made mindless. I think if you're an authoritarian thinker, if you're suspicious of authorities, but you're a kind of authoritarian in yourself, I think you really lean into the Walking Dead theory about humanity. And then at the same time, you'll watch it thinking we shouldn't be so mindless. This is what could happen to us, and you're worried about it. That people are mindlessly following the quote unquote fake news, or or what mainstream news, whatever the word is. It can be applied. The zombie monster can be applied in all these different ways. There's probably a zombie story about quote unquote wokeism. There's probably a zombie story about social media. They fits all those categories where anyone's trying to go herd mentality.
Totally agree.
Which is, if you read the philosophy of Rene Girard, who talked about mimetic desire. Now, mimesis is this Greek word for imitation.
Right.
And mimetic desire is very simple if you say it like this. Like, I think I said this in an episode that we recorded once about how I'm assuming that, I think those new Tesla trucks are hideous. I think they look like someone didn't finish.
Right, sure.
But I'm assuming that people who say they're hideous are going to find them loving them at some point because people have them.
Sure.
They're going to be assigned a status. We tend to start wanting what other people have.
Right.
That plays for Rene Girard into the idea of the scapegoat and mob mentality, and he applies it to the language of crucifixion and Jesus. But the idea is that like we will imitate each other and kind of one up each other, and if you have a herd mentality, that's why people can act so inhumane in big crowds when bad stuff starts to happen. We feed off each other's anger and vitriol, and we even advance it. And people will do stuff that they wouldn't otherwise do. It's called mimetic desire. And that's part and parcel to stuff going on in these stories. So there's tons of monsters. And, we could, sometimes I think when you just look at a modern day monster, whether it's Michael Myers or you look at Freddy Krueger, they fit into some of they will have accoutrement, they will have weapons, they will have presentation, they will have a myth, folklore, whatever. But when you pull back all the layers, each story is kind of coming down to one or two like base human fears, like things that's really for us. Right. And I think all of that spiritually. So back to the fact that we're talking about spirituality here, because all of that says something about our deepest longings as a creature, a human creature. Maybe social longings, but definitely individual longings. I think it might say something of our need for the transcendent. That's my argument, because I do. But it definitely says something about our ultimate need and our want. And it says something about things that we're working through. So I'm very adamant that as a spiritual practice, I think people ought to watch and survey their media with just a little more thoughtfulness.
Sure.
I don't care horror film or a comedy. Like ask what it is about it. And I know we all want sometimes just popcorn fun. Sometimes we just want an escape.
Sure.
But ask yourself the question, what's really being said? What's being played with here?
Right.
Sometimes the material that you're looking at can actually add to your life. It can give you greater depth of meaning. Sometimes you can recoil at what it's saying and be aware that that's out there in the world. That's an anxiety. That's something we're deep. If it's got an audience at all, that means a portion of us are dealing with that fear or that.
That's exactly right.
So I think watching can be a lens or a mirror, a lens for us to see how is feeling, or a mirror just about who we are.
Yeah.
That then becomes a spiritual practice in watching with that openness. So I think that, like, if you're more acutely aware of the concerns of the world, then I think you can walk it better, and not just for yourself. I mean, just literally walk it better.
I love that the spiritual practice we're recommending this week is go watch some horror movies.
Yeah. Unless you're triggered. So
That's right.
Unless it's something you can't handle, right?
Right. Absolutely.
I watched a horror film about grief. It's called The Babadook. It's really terrifying. It's about grief. And grief is the monster. They call it the Babadook, and there's all this accoutrement, and really it's creepy. I mean, it's really effective. But it really is about the human condition and grief. In watching it, I became aware of my own grief. In watching it, I also became more compassionate towards my friend's grief. It opened me up. And I think that if you can do that, you should. If you can't, that's okay. Watch something else. But, that's why we come up with monster stories. It's not because we're sick. I always tell people always tell me, when they talk about their interests, they go, oh, and I know this is weird. You're going to think I'm crazy, but I'm really fascinated by serial killers. And I'm like, clearly we love true crime as a culture. Clearly, it makes a lot of money. But the reason why is not because you are a serial killer. Like, that's what they think. You're going to think, well, if I'm fascinated by it, I must have this morbid desire. No.
Right.
Because you have the same desire that all of us do, and that is to solve the mysteries. And why do people do these hideous things? You're fascinated by that because you just want to know why.
Right.
At base, right? So
absolutely,
it's about our monsters, right? So you got any recommendations? Because we're gonna wrap up now. But any recommendations, Alan, for monsters? I mean, we gave some of your great material.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Mangroves, please check it out. I got a comic book adaptation coming out next year, but Mangroves as an illustrated prose book right now, and of course, Big in Japan, by Tim Price. But then as far as monster stories that I really love, you give me your recommendation. I'll give you a good recommendation once you're done.
Oh, I will tell you this, that I think that right now we're seeing a bunch of monsters or villains their stories are being retold, and people like to call them constructed or reconstructed or postmodern versions. But
sure.
Like Wicked is about the Wicked Witch of the East. We're telling these stories from the perspective of the monster. Maybe they're really not monsters and just misunderstood. Like that, there's a reason for that telling, which is pretty profound and interesting to me. But let me go back to your question. So some of that I really like. Stephen Ozma is a philosophy professor in Illinois who has a podcast with Paul Giamatti called The Chinwag, and he's got a couple good books about the academic study of monsters that I commend to anyone who wants to know more. I think he's a lapsed, no longer a believing Catholic, and he's really into Eastern philosophy. And as they wax on their show, I always think there is no real good reason why they need to bypass Christianity altogether, but they keep doing it. But
sure.
The podcast itself is kind of like dealing with the Fortean and weird and supernatural, spooky, and sci-fi. Sure. Find it delightfully interesting. But his book on monsters, I really like. And then I will say that in my house right now, Michael Myers is like almost he is the monster that scared me most as a kid. And because of that, I have his mask, and I've got people buy me stuff. I've got socks. I've got a mug that says "Slay all day." I've got a saint candle with Michael Myers on. My kids have never seen one of his movies, but they talk about him as though he were a mascot in my house. Well, I sort of feel like a bad father, or maybe a really good one. But it's interesting how, to me, those monsters can become like something different than just the things that scare us. They have all the cultural appropriation of nostalgia and things wrapped up. So now almost Michael Myers is this character of fun in my house, even though the kids aren't going to watch any of his movies. So I don't know what to tell you. That Slay all day mug that my buddy.
Oh yeah, sure.
Right there. And I see it as a motivation for me to work hard.
Yeah, nice. That's perfect.
There you go. I don't know. Yeah.
All right. I came up with 2 recommendations I'm going to give you because I feel like I need to promote my comic book brethren. So I've got so the comic book that I'm going to recommend is called Ragnarok. It's by a guy named Walt Simonson, and Walt is most famous for having popularized the Marvel version of Thor, which is why he's now doing his own independent Ragnarok. He was drawing Thor back in the 80s.
Wow.
But Ragnarok is his like basically Ragnarok is zombie Thor.
Okay.
Because he's coming back after the Twilight of the Gods, to start the world anew, basically. And there's a ton of amazing, super interesting monsters that Simonson's designed based on Norse myth. So that stuff is outstanding. But for a filmic thing, I want to mention there's an artist and filmmaker that I follow pretty closely. His name is Dave McKean. Big fan of Dave McKean. Not his most recent film, but a film that he made, oh man, I guess it was almost a decade ago now, is called Luna. And Luna is fantastically interesting, but it's also not what you're probably expecting from a traditional monster movie. It is, all the monsters are basically in fantastical dream sequences, but the whole story is about a couple trying to deal with the death of their child. His most famous movie is called Mirror Mask, which is an unofficial sequel to the film Labyrinth, made by the Jim Henson Company.
Awesome. Very cool. Well, thank you for those recs. Everybody, listen, you may not like monster stories, but you live in a world where they're told.
That's right.
You want to know why? Is because we're dealing with our fears in some way or another. And our fears might say something to us about things we need to address, need for God, the transcendent, and certainly maybe about how we can navigate this world together better. Remember,
exactly.
Interested in a world we want to make, hopefully one without monsters. But now, God bless. Take care, everybody.
Hey, it's the mummy himself. In the decomposed flesh, baby. Wait a minute. I thought it was supposed to be creepy down here in these pyramids. What are you guys doing?
Why, we're swinging. Well, all dressed up, nowhere to go when you're rapping in the mommy's rags. Room in the tomb for a swinging show when you're rapping in the mommy's rags. I got a symphony in the ossuary. Take a pause for the gauze, mama, look at me. Oh, Cleopatra, she's looking at you when you're rapping in the mommy's rags. Fairs on my head, I'm dapper and dead when I'm rapping in the mommy's rags. Wink from a sphinx, I'm quite unique, just a rapping in the mommy's rags. My name is Otis Bay, I got something to say. Reincarnated mama, she's a-coming my way. Slipped in the grip, don't give me no lip. We'll be rapping in the mommy's rags. Well, I've been dead for thousands of years, but that don't matter none. Read my scroll and let it roll. The time has come to have some fun. That ain't toilet paper on my shoe. It's a dressing like you've never seen. Imhotep's gonna stay in step, and I can get mighty mean. Make you scream and shout when I'm rapping in the mommy's rags. Claws can miss the clapping when the eye stops rapping, just a rapping in the mommy's rags. Well, we're making a fuss in the sarcophagus, so come on down and dance with us. Got the hottest band underneath the sand when I'm rapping in the mommy's rags. Well, I'm rapping, I'm flapping, I'm a tit-tat to the toe tapping, in the mommy's rags.
Jarrod had no idea I was going to play that at the end of this episode. That's The Mummy's Rag by the Silver Scream Spook Show. The Silver Scream Spook Show is led by a guy there in Atlanta named Shane Morton. Shane and a bunch of his friends get together and they put on classic horror movies at one of the theaters there in Atlanta. And I recorded this album for him along with my friend Tim Price that I mentioned at the beginning of the episode a long time ago now, maybe 15 years ago. And for that particular tune, I did the horn arrangement and the upright bass solo. On the record itself, I'm doing a bunch of, I play bass on it and I do a bunch of drum programming and that sort of thing. Hope you enjoyed it. Have a wonderful spooky season, guys.